Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, my colleague Anastasia and I have a fascinating conversation with Luke Timmerman. Luke is engaging and has non-traditional background, as well as a unique approach on biotech journalism. His impact on the field is massive through the Timmerman Report, his podcast called The Long Run, and the charity hikes he runs via the Timmerman Traverse. A quick background on Luke. He is a distinguished journalist and author who has been at the forefront of biotechnology reporting since 2001 and has firmly established himself as a leading voice in the field. With a career that includes writing for prestigious publications like the Seattle Times and Bloomberg News, and later founded the Timmerman Report in 2015. His book, called Hood, Trailblazer of the Genomics Age, received high praise and was named one of Kirkus Review's 100 Best Indie Books of 2017. Luke's contributions to biotechnology journalism have earned him significant recognition, including being named one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology by Scientific American in 2015. He's received numerous top journalism awards, such as the Scripps Howard National Journalism Award and the Gerald Loeb Award. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Luke also spent an academic year as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. Outside of his professional achievements, Luke is an avid outdoorsman who has successfully summited Mount Everest. His passion for mountaineering extends to philanthropy, where his efforts have helped raise over $10 million for causes like cancer research and poverty alleviation. We had a lot of fun on this podcast and hope you do too.
Thank you for joining Nucleate Podcast, Luke. We're very excited to have you with us today, especially in this rather unusual setting when you are the guest and not the interviewer. So to start off, we'd like to focus on your journey and the early influences that shaped who you are today. You grew up on a farm in southwestern Wisconsin, so could you share with us how these early experiences inspired and guided your career?
Yeah, Anastasia, thank you so much to you and the Nucleate team for having me on this podcast. I'm a big fan of your organization and have had a chance to write about it from early days. Um, and yes, thank you for this question, which about where I come from, because I think this is our early influences are really important. It's a thing that I ask all of my guests on my show about, and people often don't. They shy away from it in the usual business environment. Um, but I think it's quite important. So yes, I did grow up on a small family farm in southwestern Wisconsin. And that was, yeah, fifth generation, I think. So it was deeply ingrained in my family and community that I was surrounded by. My dad, in particular, was also in the U.S. military. He was an Army Ranger during the Vietnam era. And for those who don't know, the Army Rangers is a special forces group, much like the Navy SEALs. So he was very tough and used to encountering hard things, both I think it instilled a sense of mission and duty to whether it be your family, your farm that you're surrounded by, or your uh, your, your brothers in arms when he was in combat. So I tagged along with him as a kid. I did all kinds of work around the farm, and I loved it. You know, I did what had to be done each day. So that feeding the pigs, cutting the hay, baling the hay. Maybe if a piece of equipment broke down, I had to figure out with my dad how to fix it because otherwise, I mean, it just wouldn't get done. So I learned a lot of good disciplined work habits each and every day, and that sense of mission and duty to others who depend on you. And it's funny because I look back now at the time as a kid. I mean, we didn't have a lot of money. This is blue collar, working class upbringing. And I'd go to school and you see other kids that have nicer things, or they're talking about going off to fancy colleges and such. And I thought I was at something of a disadvantage at that time.
Mhm.
But as I've gotten older, I think I've come to realize that the things that I got from those early experiences have turned into an advantage later in life. Some of that struggle, some of that encountering of hardship, the resilience, the sense of duty. It's all um, it's all been really, really important for me throughout life.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, what inspired your decision to pursue journalism? Because I can imagine that there have been some expectations to follow your family footsteps and take over the farm. So, how did you navigate these and ended up choosing a different path for yourself?
That's a good question. So this was the 1980s when I was growing up, and small family farms were going away. They were being absorbed by larger corporate agribusiness entities. So the right there were some hard years because of those economic forces, and also there were drought years. It was stressful for my parents to make a living while I was in, say, growing up in school. I don't think there was a plan or desire for me to take that over. I got good grades in school, and everybody was encouraging me to go to college and find something else to do. And so that was my plan. Um, I I pursued journalism. I think partly because I grew up in this small town place, didn't travel much, never saw the ocean, or never got on a plane until I was 17 years old, kind of thing. So I kind of wanted to explore, see the world, meet new kinds of people. And journalism was this just almost like a license for a curious person to go around and just ask questions, observe, ask questions, learn about other people and all kinds of things they do.
So, let's fast forward a little bit to your early career after university. One of the first jobs that you took was at the Capital Times, where you were involved in investigative journalism. Could you share with us how this experience was like and how it shaped your approach to news reporting and journalism in general?
One of the great things about journalism is there's so many different types of it that you can go down. So I didn't at 18, I didn't have to decide, oh, I'm going to be this one thing, and that's my destined career path forever. So I started out covering sports because that was just something that I was interested in. I played high school sports. I got to go to the University of Wisconsin and cover Big Ten athletics, both football and basketball. And so I learned things like how to get my facts right, double check them, write fast on deadline, and serve an audience. It was a professional audience. I wrote for the hometown newspaper, circulation about 30,000 newspapers. So like I had a boss and I had responsibilities, and I learned some of the basics of the craft that way. And then I decided, well, there's other types of journalism I might want to do. The games I don't, not sure I really want sports to be my career path in journalism. So I looked at local government and started covering city hall, county government, learning how decisions got made on the local level. Again, this is like opening up a whole other window of how the world works. And I was just curious and learning, and I got to do that and then share what I learned with the readers in Madison, Wisconsin each day. And you mentioned investigative reporting. Well, I did actually get involved in I discovered what you might call an abuse of power by a local city council person, and really felt that strong need to expose it to the light of day to the voters. Um, that's how our democracy is supposed to work, to provide accountability. So I saw some of the power in good, hard hitting, fact based journalism, and I had the benefit of strong editors, wise counsel to help me do that.
It's very interesting to see how your journey in journalism evolved across such different areas. So, looking back, what were some of the most valuable lessons or skills that you developed during these times?
Well, I think all journalists have to have a healthy skepticism. And so it's not just a matter of jotting down what someone tells you who might be in a position of authority. Um, Sometimes there's just a lot more to the story. So I think I learned to poke and prod and look around corners. Um, and you could say sometimes that manifests in an investigative story. So it's exposing wrongdoing. That's one form of it. But other times you could call it more just explanatory. Um, so the world's complicated, and sometimes we only see a narrow slice of it, or we accept a single explanation when there's just more to the story. So I think that mentality guides me in today with coverage of biotech.
Speaking of biotech, when did it come to your life and how did you make the transition?
That's a funny twist of fate. So I had done a few internships at local newspapers. My senior year of college, I came out to the Seattle Times, and so for a kid from Wisconsin, this was a move to the big time. Seattle Times had just come off of winning 2 Pulitzer Prizes that year. It had a terrific group of investigative reporters and photographers and editors. I just came out to the West and I saw mountains and ocean, a beautiful place and a dynamic community and a great newspaper. And I thought, wow, this is what I want to be when I grow up, a newspaper reporter for the Seattle Times. And so I did a couple beginning jobs when I graduated, and I came back at about, let's see, I was about 24 at the time for my first big city newspaper job. And I was just a general business reporter. That was the job they had at the time. And about a year into this, the an opening came for the biotech specific beat reporter. Now, this is a interesting moment in history. Like the newspaper was big and economically healthy enough to employ a person to work full time on coverage of this emerging industry in the community. There was a flagship company at the time called Immunex, which had developed Enbrel, one of the biggest selling drugs of all time for autoimmune diseases, a TNF inhibitor. And this was just a fascinating company. There was science and medicine and business, and I got my opportunity to learn from the ground up. I mean, I had no basic training in biology. I really knew very little about business fundamentals, truth be told. I just got kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool. Like, be a curious person, come back with 2 or 3 interesting stories a week. We'll edit them. We'll help you and all that. And I had this opportunity to get out and learn from a lot of people in the lab and in the offices, and I found that I loved it, and I've stuck with it ever since.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So now you're conveying highly complex scientific topics to a very specialized audience, despite, as you mentioned before, not having this formal scientific training. So my question is, how do you approach understanding these subjects? And more importantly, how do you manage to explain them so clearly to the audience?
Thank you for saying that. I'd say it takes a lot of practice, a lot of repetition. I definitely those first couple years was scared. I felt out of my depth. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to make a mistake in the newspaper and embarrass myself and the whole newspaper. And um, so I had to work through that to get to sort of basic competency. Um, and then as time went on, I mean, coming back to one of the great things about journalism is you have this license to go ask the experts. So I don't need to be the expert on any one thing, but I can call the world expert on cancer and immunology and Alzheimer's and gene sequencing. And I mean, or how the financial markets work. I can talk to anybody about anything. And I think having the beginner's mind can be an asset um, in translating stories for broad general audiences. So science writers tend to come from one of two backgrounds. Sometimes they come from a general journalism background like mine, and sometimes they come from a deep scientific training background. Maybe they get a PhD somewhere in one thing. But when they do that, they naturally, on the first day of getting a writing assignment, you're writing about something that's different than what your PhD was in. So you have to like flip back into that beginner's mind and ask some of the fundamental questions and call up the experts and learn. So either type of person from that background can be effective. Um, I think I found that over time, I got to learn what the fundamental questions are in many of these therapeutic areas, or what some of the big challenges in drug development are in general, and it just kind of that knowledge base accrued with time.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Also in med school, we were taught that if you don't know something, just ask. It was very important to know that there were always experts around, and you just have to have the courage to ask.
Really important point. Not being afraid to ask a dumb question. That it can be something of a superpower.
Yes, exactly. So, what would you say has been the most exciting and also the most complex topic that you had to dig into?
Well, I started um, covering biotech in 2001, and this was right after the Human Genome Project. The draft sequence had been completed, and it was in the news a lot, like covers of the magazines and that sort of thing. So there were a lot of people who were curious about what's going on here with genomics, and is this really going to revolutionize treatment of disease and usher in the era of personalized medicine and all that people were talking about at the time. And I found it really challenging, but also really interesting to learn some of the basics of genetics and what was happening between genes and cells and uh, observable phenotypes of disease. And so I I actually got to cover Leroy Hood and his Institute for Systems Biology, which was just getting started around the same time that I had started covering biotech. He was um, formerly at Caltech and had moved to the University of Washington years previous, uh, best known for developing the automated DNA sequencing instruments that were later developed by Applied Biosystems and made the Human Genome Project possible. um, so this he was a really interesting guy, visionary, looking far into the future about how these technologies could help us ask and answer more and more questions about fundamental questions of biology. And I think getting to know him and learning how he thought about the future was uh, really interesting and challenging. And I ended up years later writing a book about him.
A book that won a prize basically as one of the 100 best books in 2017. So, could you share with us more about it and especially the journey of writing it?
Yeah, so this was, let's see, about 12, 13 years ago. And I was feeling at that time that I had covered a lot of breaking news in the biotech industry and had found that balance between some of the this just in breaking news and more longer form magazine style feature articles that take a little more time. And that's one of the tasks of a journalist, is balancing the short term versus the long term projects, finding ways to get both of those things done. But I had that feeling that maybe there's something more here. I'd like to write a book that takes even more time and deeper reporting to do it right anyway. And so I felt like Hood was one of these people who had had a big impact on the world of biotechnology. There was a great story there, both in the development of the technology and his personality, which was complicated and instructive for how academic science sometimes works well and sometimes not. Um, so I thought there was a great story there. It had not been told, and that I was very well positioned to tell it, having gotten to know him over the previous, say, 10 years. And it happened to come around the time that the Steve Jobs book had come out from Walter Isaacson. And he had shown, because he had done most of his interviews with Jobs while Jobs was still alive. And so it was something of a living biography most biographies, of course, are written about people years after they've died, and all you have is the paper trail, the historical record to mine, and maybe some people who his kids or people who worked with him are still around. But I thought, well, this is really interesting. There are a lot of major players in biotech who are still alive, and I have the opportunity to go interview. Maybe I should take advantage of that and try to tell their story while they're still alive. And so I did.
Yes, it's always good to have the person you're writing about to share the insights directly with you. Are you planning to write another book soon?
Oh, I have other ideas for books, but I haven't made a lot of headway on them. But stay tuned.
Yes, definitely. So now I'd like to focus on the Timmerman Report, which you started in 2015, if I'm correct. Just a short recap, it's an independent subscription-based resource offering in-depth coverage and analysis of current biotech trends and developments. So what inspired you to start it, and where did you see a gap in the biotech coverage at this time that you felt needed to be filled?
Yeah, so by this time, I had been covering biotech for almost 15 years. And I had been at three real places: Seattle Times newspaper, where I learned a lot of the basics of how biotech works. Then I went to Bloomberg News for a little while and covered biotech on the national level for a financial audience. And then I took a stint at a startup company called Xconomy. So that was really entrepreneurial, like early days of internet publishing, and I was trying to write interesting stories about biotech, but also um, running events and things to help build up the economic business, the business model to support our journalism. So was an early employee. I learned a lot about how businesses get started and grow. And I happen to be interviewing entrepreneurial biotech people as they thought about the similar concepts. Um, Now, after, let's see, a little over 5 years there, I decided that I wanted to finish that book on Hood, and I really had too many responsibilities at the time with breaking news on the day-to-day basis. So if I was really going to finish this book, I needed to take a leave, and it really meant I just needed to quit my job and roll the dice on myself. Both first, I would finish the book. Um, and then I would figure out what to do next, whether that be go to work at a large media company, perhaps, or start my own thing. Those were the two ideas. And so I came to the end of that book leave and decided that I thought I was offering value. I heard this from readers that uh, my stories would help them pick investments or help them find a job, or it opened the door to partnership conversations between a small company and a large company. So I just thought, wow, if people are getting a lot of value out of my coverage, and these are free articles, but on the web, by the way, and the advertising model, like that I would somehow reach many eyeballs, and that I would collect some sort of percentage of advertising sales that might be attached to that. That just wasn't panning out. And so I thought, could I create a subscription model around my biotech coverage, where I ask people to pay a low annual fee. At the time, it was $99 a year. It's now twice that much. But at the time, it was $99 a year. Um, if you've received value from my coverage, will you pay $100 a year and if I could get 1,000 of those people, this was in line with the Kevin Kelly 1,000 true fans theory of content creation, that would generate $100,000 of gross income. Now, of course, you have to pay taxes and you have some expenses with running your business, but not that much. It would be enough to support my family and give me the editorial independence that was really important. So I was trying to combine business independence. So I would be supported directly from the readers to continue doing the kind of biotech coverage that I wanted to do. And I would have essentially a business model with a thousand-legged stool. So I would have the independence to call a spade, to pursue investigative topics if warranted. Um, so that was the idea almost 10 years ago. And this is even before Substack. I mean, these were early days when lots of venture capitalists told me they thought paid content and paywalls were a pretty bad idea, that um, that's just not what readers and advertisers were looking for. Um, but I gave it a whirl and I'm glad I did.
Yes, it ended up being a great idea. So in 2017, you launched a podcast, The Long Run, which has become one of the top podcasts in the science category. So could you share with us what led you to start it and how it complements your work with the Timmerman Report?
Yeah, so I had been experimenting with different forms of media in the years previous. So social media, for one, had come up. Twitter was a thing, and so um, I played around with social media, short micro blogs, you could call them, longer form news and feature articles. I had written a book, so everything from a tweet all the way through a book, and had tried the audio form as well. And it started with just guest appearances on the local NPR affiliate in Seattle and in Boston. Something would happen in the news and they would like a commentator to come on and explain it to their general interest audience. And I found that I felt naturally pretty comfortable in front of the microphone on the radio, even live radio. And I created this podcast with Meg Terrell at Stat called Signal. We did that for a little over a year. Um, that that ran its course and went away. But I thought actually this was inspired in part by some of the work that I had done on the Hood book previously. So as part of the research on the Hood book, I spent time going into university archives and reading these oral histories with some of the great scientists of the 20th century in molecular biology. I would read these transcripts that went for hours and hours, where a trained science historian at Caltech or MIT or someplace like that would sit down with leading scientists and ask them all about their childhood, their upbringing, their scientific influences, how they chose projects, why they did some of the things that they did, some of the personal rivalries that they might have had when they were competing for the big discovery, all the kind of stuff that doesn't really show up in the literature. So I thought these oral histories are a real treasure trove. And gosh, I mean, they go for 4 hours. I thought, could I do some kind of miniaturized version of an oral history for an hour with some of the people who are making things happen in biotechnology today? And that was kind of the rough idea for the long run, that the show would go for an hour. I would explore some of the early life, the key influences, and then move into key career turning points, ask people why they choose some of the projects or do some of the things they do, and really dig in for the closing half of each episode about what they're doing right now that might have a big impact on patients. Um, yeah, so that was in 2017 that podcast got going.
Could you explain why you chose the name The Long Run for the podcast?
Yeah, well, it it has multiple meanings. The most important one is that biotech itself is a long run. It's unlike most other industries where uh, things just don't take so long. In technology, the product development cycle is a matter of several quarters, usually, from formation to it's something that we can ship and sell. And in biotech, it's 10 years often or more, and hundreds of millions of dollars, and lots of risk and uncertainty along the way. So it just requires that stamina, that resilience. There are personal characteristics that are just absolutely essential for anybody who seeks to accomplish anything meaningful and big. in this industry. So you have to be ready for the long run. And yes, of course, I mean, I also run and I like to go on long runs and endurance sports and all. So that had a double meaning there for me, but I'm not sure how many people get that or care.
Before we dig into that, let's talk about your long run. So you've been running Timmerman Report and the podcast for quite some time now, and it's become highly influential in the biotech space. So what's next for you? What's the next big challenge?
Well, I have been working a lot on my charitable activities recently, which I suppose you probably want to ask about that too. Um, I mean, I'm really blessed to have the newsletter be successful, the podcast as well, and now this third aspect of what I do with using the platform that I have built over the years that that speaks to this audience of biotech entrepreneurs and investors to kind of use that position of influence to benefit good causes that I care about and that I know lots of people in the community care about too.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. One of the interesting things, Luke, that you talk about in the Timmerman Report is you have a focus on entrepreneurship, and you as an entrepreneur yourself, and I say you have a lot of grit based on the background you told us about yourself growing up on a farm and working really hard, and I think that goes well with entrepreneurship in terms of the hard work ethic, in terms of the duty to others, and serving people through the types of entrepreneurship that you do. Our audience at Nucleate includes a lot of founders and aspiring founders. So my question is, based on your experience with the Timmerman Report and the Long Run podcast, you've spoken to lots of founders and CEOs like Sean McClain from Absci, among many others. What do you think some of the broader trends are in the successful founders that you've met along the years?
Yeah, so it is important to have a good eye for talent. If you're a venture capitalist listening, you know what I'm talking about. But I think the same applies for journalism. I want to um, have a good sense for who the people are that are likely to make things happen. It's not easy. Nobody gets it 100% right. But of course, people need to be, they're all smart. There has to be, um, baseline intelligence to do these jobs. But there's also that there's an integrity that I look for with people who are just being honest about what they know and don't know and what they still have to prove, both to themselves and to their team and to the wider world of investors and partners. Um, I think sometimes there can be a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, and sometimes that comes from a place of good intentions and belief that you'll be able to do things. But people in this business, it depends on trust to make it through that long haul. You have to have people who are willing to go with you on a long journey with a leap of faith. There's just not a lot of room for fudging things. People will like you can get away with it once, and but it will catch up, and people will not be there with you along the journey. So I'm looking for people who have that combination of intelligence and grit and integrity. One good sign often is when things go wrong. Do you when something fails, will you say that it failed? And maybe we learned something. I mean, there's always a silver lining. That's great. But yeah, people who struggle to tell the full truth are often revealing something that's not not very flattering and doesn't bode very well for their future in this industry. Your reputation is everything.
So it's an interesting dynamic that you're describing, that you have to have rock solid integrity. Yet at the same time, you have to be a little bit delusional in your idea. You have to be willing to take on a risk, or you view something as lower risk than other people do, and you're willing to invest your entire life on something that, to your point, a lot of venture investors probably aren't going to invest in. You're going to hear a lot of no's. So it's an interesting paradoxical dynamic that you have to be in love with your idea, and you have to be in love with it more than probably reality will bear out, or it'll be slower than you want it to be. Yet you still have to be have that rock solid integrity and be honest when you're not going to necessarily meet all of your lofty goals, but it might be heading in that right direction, or being able to admit if you failed and what pivots you need to take in light of that.
It's really well said. Yeah, you have to make a lot of these decisions with great conviction, but on incomplete data. You always would like to know more. There's a certain amount of belief, almost almost religious like faith, in your ability to solve these kind of problems. I'm thinking about a company that I covered in the early days, Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, John Maraganore, and he and I have talked about this quite a bit. A very scientifically grounded, show me the data kind of guy, for sure. But at the same time, he had to have that just almost religious like fervor in the early days that RNA interference will become a platform for new medicines. And even though we don't know how to deliver them to the cell types today, we will figure that out. And he needs to convey that enthusiasm along with and that belief along with the harsh reality of where you are in the moment, without blowing smoke at people.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, like a religious fervor. But based on my friends who are entrepreneurs, I've definitely seen it. You have to have that deep rooted conviction in your ideas, and willingness to persevere, in order to keep on pursuing the idea. Although at the same time, you also have to know when you need to let go or when you need to pivot. And I'm sure Al Nylam went through several pivots early on where it didn't turn out exactly the way they expected, but still having that overall vision, that they found truly compelling.
Absolutely. These are fine lines, gray zones.
Yeah,
That's part of what makes it interesting.
absolutely. And now I think it'd be an interesting compare and contrast, since you're also very familiar with the venture world, which has been coming up multiple times, and I'm assuming very different traits, some similarities, I'm sure, with entrepreneurs in terms of wanting a vision for a better world in biotech specifically, passion for innovative technologies, but the lens I assume is very different in terms of having a broader view of the industry, understanding different landscapes, and like you said, having an eye for talent. So curious, what contrast you found from the very successful VCs you've been speaking with over the years relative to entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so there's a lot of VCs out there who maybe don't add a whole lot of value to the equation other than the money. There are a few that really do their homework, their hard scientific due diligence, and also see themselves in a supporting role. So, yes, they take board seats and they have responsibilities to their investors for sure. And that means holding a management accountable and asking hard questions and all that. But primarily, they're the best ones are problem solvers and they see themselves as helping the CEO navigate hard situations. They can make introductions to contacts at large pharma or to other investors. They can help broker IPOs. They can be helpful, but so I think sometimes they get into problems where they have a large enough ego of their own where they think they know all the answers or know better and try to assert themselves a little too much. I think the really good ones have like that curiosity, that hunger to make a difference, so along with some humility about what their role really is.
That makes a lot of sense. So still that similar drive and ambition, but really focusing on a supporting role. And I assume connecting the dots between different companies they've worked with in the past and providing that wealth of experience to a CEO while not necessarily having that operating experience. Although some nowadays definitely do have operating experience and can add value there as well.
Some do, but they also have sometimes a really good sense for spotting patterns because they get exposed to a wider group of companies and entrepreneurs that maybe the CEO doesn't. So here's an example where a VC can be really quite helpful and say, I mean, say you're an RNA editing startup today. Well, I served on the board of some company years ago that was working through a delivery challenge in CRISPR or other RNA medicines. And have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? You could talk to this person over there. That's where the breadth of their experience can really be helpful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I say, speaking of breadth of experience, my next question is based on your experience on the long run, speaking to entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, what trends are you following and what do you think is going to be an emerging trend in the next 5, 10 years that perhaps other people aren't thinking as much about?
Well, I have been following the whole AI and drug discovery story for years now. There's been probably more talk about it than concrete results. Now, partly this last couple years, there has been a much broader societal conversation about AI being implemented more broadly in our technology tools, and that's pretty exciting in many dimensions. Hasn't quite translated yet to really kind of upset the apple cart of biopharmaceutical R&D. I think there are aspects of it that AI is going to chip away at and speed up and and squeeze out some efficiencies that are long overdue, with the ultimate long-term objective of making drug discovery and development a higher probability of success proposition. So shorter timelines, less money invested per program, um, and a higher probability of success. I think slaying the R&D productivity dragon is like the central problem. It's just, you've all heard about Eroom's law. I mean, it can't go on forever. There are tools, and these tools are throwing off lots and lots of data. Figuring out how to put those pieces together to make drug discovery better, faster, cheaper. That's the central challenge of R&D in this next generation, and I'm pretty optimistic that some big positive things are happening.
And to that point, it may take more time than the level of very excited news coverage will suggest, right? There's a lot of noise. I mean, I think ChatGPT really brought it to the fray for most people outside of the biotech field and has brought a lot of excitement to investors. So there's certainly a lot of noise. There's a lot of money going towards it. And I think the promise, to your point, is definitely there. But how long will it take, I think, is the big question, right? It's not probably not something that we're going to see drastic changes in the next 2, 3, maybe even 5 years, but 10, 15, 20 years, the expansion could be massive in terms of increasing the speed to clinical trials from discovery, as well as reducing the cost of R&D across the board.
I totally agree. It isn't as simple as, say, hoovering up all of the text off of the internet in a large language model and then, training AI on how to basically be very fluent with language. That's a single data type. But here we're dealing with these multi-level omic data types, and how do they even get structured together, and which things are important and which things are irrelevant? I mean, we don't even know a lot of those answers yet to even really begin, I think, to train the AI to its full potential, the kind that people are kind of imagining now. I think that's far out. Now, there are things, as you said, that I think AI will be useful for in the near term. More carefully prescribed bites of the apple. Like you have a template for a specific small molecule or antibody, and you want it to bind a certain way in a certain pocket, and there's lots of different permutations. The AI might be good for that and help improve on some of these parameters in the near term.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm excited to see your coverage of it as new opportunities develop there. I want to shift gears slightly, and I say slightly because a lot of people have passions that are sort of outside and unrelated to biotech. And I think what's really interesting about your story is that you found a way to marry your passions for mountaineering and running and other physical activities into something that's actually been a pretty big force in biotech with the Timmerman Traverse, which you've been doing since 2017. You mentioned earlier on that part of your charitable efforts have been organizing these expeditions and you've climbed Mount Everest. You regularly climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I know you have another hike there coming up. And usually you're providing charity funding for interesting diseases that need a lot of help. So cancer, sickle cell disease, I believe is your latest one. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to combine your interests in both mountaineering and biotech into one seamless passion?
Yeah, so this was, as you say, 2017. So I had started the Timmerman Report a couple years prior and was really all in starting my company, learning on the fly, making a few mistakes. But I had gotten to that initial goal of the 1,000 subscribers. So I had achieved what I considered viability, like this was going to work. And I had about that had achieved a certain level of influence within the industry, and I thought, is there something more that I can do with this? If I have this influence, I can of course continue writing columns, which I do, expressing my opinions about drug pricing and access to medicines around the world and all kinds of things. But maybe can I marry some of this with direct action? And it did so happen that, yeah, I love climbing mountains and it's something that I've been doing for 20 years now. At this time, I had gotten to a point in my mountaineering hobby, if you will, where it was conceivable that I could attempt Mount Everest. And so this is where I started thinking about how to combine these things. um, Looked to the guide service that I had climbed highest peak in South America with, Alpine Ascents International. And so I looked at their Everest offering, and it turned out they had an existing partnership with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in my hometown of Seattle. And that was just a light bulb moment for me because I knew the work, I knew a lot of the people over there, the pioneering work on bone marrow transplantation that had set the table for a lot of groundbreaking work in CAR T immunotherapy that happened over there. I thought, if I were to climb Mount Everest, and combine it with a fundraising appeal to the biotech community, asking them to give money to cancer research at the Fred Hutch. Um, I think that might just really excite people, maybe even electrify the community. Because, I mean, despite what you may see about Mount Everest, I mean, not that many people have climbed it. It's extremely difficult. I knew that it would take everything that I've got to physically, mentally, emotionally get ready to do this thing. Um, and uh, and people got it. And so long story short, I was able to summit Mount Everest successfully in 2018. Raised a lot of money and awareness for Fred Hutch, 340,000 on that original campaign, double what my goal was. And I got so many encouraging comments from people before and afterwards. And people saying things like, "Oh, I like to do outdoor activities too in my spare time. I've been here or there." And that got me thinking about ways for the longer term to raise more money for cancer research in the beginning. And that would involve recruiting teams of people and not just me going and climbing the next mountain.
That's fantastic, and obviously making a huge impact for the causes that you are raising for. And I'm just curious, especially with Mount Everest, but I'm sure with all of these hikes, you're taking a lot of risk. You're like you said, you're challenging yourself physically, emotionally, mentally. How have these impacted the way you go about your daily life? How have they changed your perspective in any way as far as your long term thinking?
Well, extremely rewarding. It's uh, it's changed my life for the better. That Yeah, the whole all dimensions of it, the physical, the mental, the relational. So these trips now, Mount Everest is indeed quite risky, and that was something that I was prepared to do because of long track record of experience. But my groups that I bring together, I don't ask them to do that sort of thing. Kilimanjaro is much more of a hike to the top, doesn't require any, traverses on risky glaciers or rock. Um, so I made it so it would be challenging but doable for beginners. But when people get together in these environments, they form deeply meaningful relationships. Really, really some tremendous friendships have been formed. I've formed them. Others I know have too. There's something about rolling up your sleeves for a cause and physically putting your body in the arena and doing something hard that bonds people together. So I'm really thankful for that and proud of that.
Yeah, excellent. And I can imagine that, like you said, rolling up your sleeves, you're exerting yourself, you're, traveling internationally together. Imagine you can build some very deep bonds between people. And one of the things that I find really interesting is how, not only do you have the mission for charity for the Traverse, you also have a mission for improving diversity in the field. Because of this, you've mentioned previously they have an equal balance of genders. You have people from different geographies, you have people of different races that are joining you. And I think you mentioned in a previous discussion that if you were just focused on the fundraising capability alone, you probably have a bunch of older white men. But you view this as important to broaden outreach to multiple different groups who are perhaps underrepresented in biotech and to build those strong bonds between people. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you decided on that and how you've seen the impacts of that aspect of the Traverse.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It has been really, really important to me because I think diversity is something we need to work on. Opening doors to opportunity for lots of people who have lots of things to offer. So I just thought if I were to strictly focus on the fundraising goal only, and by the way, these campaigns have now raised more than $10 million cumulatively since 2017 for all those causes you mentioned. Um, I thought it was important to not perpetuate some of the problem with closed networks, for lack of a better term, the old boy network. I mean, and maybe there's something deeper here that I don't even understand about myself. I mean, because I wasn't a member of it. I was a blue collar kid from the Midwest. I mean, I wasn't, you know, invited to apply to Harvard or whatever happens to some people. And so, yeah, I look around, I see tremendous talent. I see people with lots of things to offer, whether they are old, young, men, women, um, different race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all of the above. And I thought if I can put a group of people like this together who have something a couple important things in common, like we want to work on fighting cancer and we love outdoor adventure. That's that's kind of what you need. And if I can put these people together and then just um, let their natural talents flow. And there's so much richness, so much intellectual, so many sparks that fly on these trails. People have different points of view, whether you're a therapeutics person or a diagnostics person or software or tools. I mean, uh, people find these orthogonal interests really invigorating, and that this is part of what deepens those friendships. So I think diversity is an asset. I seek it out on these teams. I think it's part of the secret sauce.
Absolutely. And I think it serves a really important function to show that there can be social functions in biotech that bring people together. And not to say that this is purely social, but one aspect of it truly is social. And I think that's probably a lot of the challenges that people face is that there's some events that are perceived as exclusive, that not everyone necessarily gets invited to, and after work drinks, let's just say as an example. And I'm curious how you take your experience with Timmerman Traverse and your personal mission and how you have succeeded there in building bridges across different groups of people, and taking that microcosm to think about how do you think the industry as a whole can make strides and do similar things to the Timmerman Traverse in other ways to be more inclusive? Are there any lessons that we can take away from the Timmerman Traverse that we can apply to the overall industry? Since, as you mentioned, the biotech industry still does have some lack of diversity. There are underrepresented groups that we should try to empower to be more inclusive.
I think it's important to create the conditions where all sorts of people are welcome, and and also give them the time and the space to be themselves. So that's one of the things that the hiking expeditions do. So I'll give you an example. Ted Love, who's the chairman of the board of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, African American, very successful and famous for his contributions. Ted was on one of my traverses last summer for Life Science Cares. And you might look at he and I and think, boy, maybe we have something in common, like we're both interested in biotech, but he's black and I'm white. And so we're very, very different people, or we're not in the same tribe, so to speak. But when we're walking on the trail, we talk. And one thing we discovered is that, gosh, he grew up on a farm too. Well, now we both discover that, well, we have something actually pretty fundamental to who we are today in common. It's not, and you would not be able to tell this just from looking at us or reading our bio on a website. Um, we had the opportunity, we had the time and the space to be ourselves and to get to know each other at a little deeper level. And that happens on these trips regularly. And it can happen in other settings too. Companies can set up mixers and just make it easier for people to be themselves rather than always presenting, or let your hair down a little bit. Invite lots of people from who might have something to offer, make them feel welcome, and then give them the space to get to know each other at a deeper level. I think a lot of magic can happen there.
I think that's an interesting insight, and definitely what I wasn't actually expecting is the giving the space part. It doesn't necessarily have to be a very structured event. It simply needs to be an opportunity for people to genuinely connect rather than having these very formal, kind of rigid structures. It's more about creating the space for people to genuinely connect and get to know each other.
Well, I think you guys do this well at Nucleate. So I know you have an annual summit each year,
That's right.
and there is naturally going to be some structured time. So there will be presentations, and people will sit in the audience and listen and learn. But then there's all that unstructured part of it, the time in the hallway, so to speak. When you go up to get a coffee or a beer or whatever, that's that's providing some of that space. Now, often people feel a little rushed. I mean, everybody's busy. Everybody's got, a really long to-do list, but slowing things down consciously and just some gentle facilitating of getting to know each other at a deeper level. I think people can discover they have a lot of things in common, a lot of shared interests, and gosh, they once they discover that, then you know that's the first step toward collaborating on something cool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a very hopeful note too for the industry that if we continue to build spaces that are accessible to as many people as possible, facilitate those authentic connections, we can really make a dent in improving diversity in the industry.
Well, it's coming. I mean, when I look at the Nucleate group, I mean, lot of young, bright, ambitious people, and they happen to come from all over the world and different genders and geographies and perspectives, um, race, ethnicity, all of that is just it's a huge opportunity for this next generation to create that more diverse and inclusive industry because there's so many people who have a lot to offer that are not being fully tapped. They're not. They just need a little opening in the door, a tap on the shoulder, a word of encouragement, a condition where they can, like, a pool where they can start swimming in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, we appreciate you hyping up Nucleate. Diversity is part of our mission to improve accessibility to biotech to more people. And we're really excited for what's on the horizon. And on that hopeful note, Luke Timmerman, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Sam and Anastasia. It's a real pleasure to be here.